It is our pleasure to meet and have a chance to listen to an informal presentation and discussion. Professor Taylor Garcia is an associate professor in the Ethnic Studies Department. Some of you actually may know her, but from her publication. And today she's going to be talking to us about her research and also maybe her teaching and methodologies. And then after that, we'll have an open session in which we have the opportunity to ask questions and engage in discussion. So thank you so much, Daphne, for joining us today.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me.
Okay.
And I apologize that I couldn't join you all in person there. But yeah, so thank you all for having me today. Today I actually wanted to talk about my new research project, working on my second book, and what it is focusing on, at least this stage of the project, is a close look at Frantz Fanon's writings. For those of you, guessing most of you have heard of Frantz Fanon. He was a philosopher and psychiatrist that was born in the Caribbean and on the island of Martinique. He did some training in France and then became a practicing psychiatrist in Algeria. And from there, he left that position as a psychiatrist and joined the Algerian Liberation Front. And his books have been, extremely influential and inspirational for many people around the world. And even though the books were written, 70 years ago now, I still find them to be extremely relevant for today. And I think, the positions that he takes on questions are actually extremely insightful and, deserve to be looked at more closely. And so my new research project is focusing very explicitly on how he talks about African-Arab relations. Two of his four books focused a lot on a dying colonialism and toward the African Revolution. He wrote a lot about Algerians. And he takes very specific positions on African-Arab relations that I think are really important and insightful. And I'm looking at what he says with an eye towards what insights he has for thinking about Black-Brown relations here in the United States. So one of the parts of the project is, Algeria and its relationship to France and Mexico's relationship to the United States are actually very similar. And Algeria and Mexico are situated in the global economy in very similar ways. And so I'm looking at, that's what this project is focusing on. And so right now I'm sitting with Fanon's writing specifically. I asked you to read Sylvia Wynter's piece because Sylvia Wynter is also a big influence for me. And one of the things that I really appreciate about her work is that she's very in tune to the different colonial projects, clearly knows very well the Spanish colonial project within the context of the broader Americas, and includes an analysis, right? Explicitly addresses the impact that Spanish colonialism has had on discourses of Blackness, indigeneity. And this piece specifically that I asked everyone to read, she's asking us to think about how is it that this concept of the human, that we work with and that we have now, how did it come to be? We didn't always have it. It's something that was clearly produced over time. And, she talks specifically about ethnic studies, Black studies, gender studies, right? And these are fields that, I'm housed in the Ethnic Studies Department. I'm an affiliate of Critical Gender Studies. It's sort of taking a kind of bird's eye view on what are the stakes of these fields within the broader history of the university, in the context of knowledge production. And I think she really gets us to think carefully about what is the the political economy of the university, right? And so I know there is we tend to talk about the university as being an ivory tower, and very separate. And I think that speaks to the alienation, that like working class people who have been excluded from the university feel. However, I would say that, as Sylvia Wynter explains in so many of her articles, is that the work that is done here, the kind of knowledge that is produced here, profoundly shapes the world that we live in, right? That what is philosophized in the university becomes the way we think about the world. The kind of technological inventions that are created here end up shaping our world in fundamental ways, right? And so I appreciate the way she gets us to think about all of these issues. But yeah, so I thought I would read a short paper, that is thinking about these themes in Fanon's work. And I'd be, just curious to hear what you all think. What are some of your thoughts? And that, what are some questions that you have? And we can talk about methodology and things like that too. So although Algerians are on a spectrum from light to dark, and often lighter than most people living in Africa and then Fanon himself, he identified with and fought alongside them for their collective liberation. In my own reading of Fanon's work, this was not based on a poorly thought out analogy of oppression, as some have asserted, but rather was based on intentional and principled positions. His understanding of appearing in the world included a reading of structural conditions and was not premised strictly on a calculation of physical traits. Fanon had very different responses towards colonists who enacted anti-Black attitudes, in contrast towards the colonized who expressed anti-Black attitudes. How did he differentiate between them? And beyond that, how did he assess racialized claims between colonized groups? His identification with Algerians was through an economic, philosophical, and psychopolitical assessment of what we are dealing with at the level of sociogeny. How the colonization of the Americas and the Atlantic slave trade fundamentally restructured the world, both economically and intersubjectively, and that it had produced particular pathologies, namely anti-Blackness. This pathology presents as a deviation from forming relationships that recognize the self and the other as a human being. Among the colonized, Fanon diagnosed this as depersonalization, a major problem facing those living in the economic periphery, if we are to communally take responsibility for the world we live in. It was a pathology Fanon witnessed among not only Algerians, but also West Indians and Sub-Saharan Africans, and he certainly would have witnessed it among Mexicans as well. Fanon responded to anti-Blackness with agency, a sense of responsibility, and perhaps surprisingly, with empathy. The how and why of these responses is manifested in Fanon's decision to become a militant of the Algerian National Liberation Front and one of their leading intellectuals. What does it mean to have empathy for someone who does not see you as a full human being? We do have to be alert to issues like codependence, people-pleasing, enabling, or other coping mechanisms that sacrifice one's own well-being. But for Fanon, empathy is the capacity to apprehend the motivational structure of the psychic life of the other person, to apprehend that they have a worldview, and to have concern for that person's relatedness to transcendence. It is to relate to others, understanding that the psychic framework they are operating from is one that the self shares. To counter anti-Blackness among the colonized, Fanon pushes us to begin from a place of human freedom, which involves taking responsibility for reasons that one has decided are worthy, not from predetermined or external expectations. He also calls on us to take an active role in stimulating the capacity for empathy among the colonized, even those we may first encounter as incorrigible. From reading his work, it is evident that the Algerians he first encountered were anti-Black, but Fanon went about making contact with Algerian revolutionaries, formed relationships with them, and became a force within their movement. Fanon tells us he begins with an economic analysis, right? So in Black Skin, White Mask, he talks about first an economic analysis. His understanding of the economic is not abstract, but situated and embodied. He knows that the beginning point of any economic system is the labor that people do. The conditions through which labor appears defines the nature of every society, and it is through their labor that people realize themselves. The most widely understood basis for Fanon's commitment to Algerian liberation was that it was brutally colonized by the French. As is frequently narrated in writings about Algeria, French colonization involved turning the most fertile lands into vineyards to produce wine. The wheat fields that had kept Algerians nourished were turned into a crop for a product that was prescriptive in their own culture, an alcoholic drink. In a further act of violence by the French, the land left for Algerians was either inhospitable or prone to erosion, ultimately leading to insufficient crops and destitution. With no other viable economic sector to absorb all the dispossessed, the majority of the colonized were quite literally left to fight or die. This was the economic reality of the majority of Algerians, as 75% of them worked in agriculture. I believe this aspect of why Fanon was committed to Algerian liberation is better known, but there is more that he had to take a position on. There were Algerian elites who managed to capitalize on the expropriation of people's land and expanded their individual prosperity. The Algerian bourgeoisie were about 1% of the population. There was a secondary sector of the Algerian economy at this time that employed about 25% of the people in the areas of mining, utilities, construction, and public works. As is better known, widely known for some, Fanon critiqued the assumption that the proletariat was always the revolutionary class, as proletarianized Algerians in the secondary sector were privileged in relation to the peasant majority. Because of the Algerian proletariat's steady paychecks and relatively comfortable lifestyles, the labor struggles of that class would not resonate with the rural majority. If putting the people into their rightful place was Fanon's goal, focusing on the small, comparatively privileged proletariat in Algeria would not accomplish what was needed. The part of the Algerian situation that I don't think gets talked about and seems important for today is that Algeria could have been interpreted as quote-unquote privileged in relation to other French colonies. Algeria was the colony most integrated into France's economy. It was the only French colony to be administered through the Ministry of the Interior as an extension of France, as opposed to other French colonies that were administered either through the Ministry of Colonies or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as external entities. For most of its colonial history, Algeria had the most deputy representatives in the French government, in contrast to other colonies that had no deputies or far fewer in number. In addition, Fanon could have decided to focus on and perpetuate the colonial narrative of the racial differences between Arab and Kabyle Berber peoples in Algeria. From all this, Fanon could have emphasized Algerian Arab privilege and performed various acts of distancing himself from them. But instead, he became a militant of the Algerian FLN. So how did he come to this decision? So one of the things that is central in Fanon's thought and that he points out is that what is different about European colonialism and compared to previous forms of colonialism was the introduction of race as a way for organizing the division of labor and social relations. Okay, so that racialization was specific to European colonization. And so in today's vocabulary, Algerians might be referred to as brown or white adjacent. In Fanon's time, too, there were debates about what exactly an Arab was. Some argued that they were mixed, a mixture of European and African. Others referred to them dismissively as white Africans. But Fanon decided that the people he was facing in North Africa were not in fact white, even if light-skinned. He decided that if they self-identified as a white Algerian or espoused anti-Black attitudes, that they were in a state of depersonalization, right? So he assessed what was going on among Northern Africans very differently than how he assessed what was going on in France. And given the physical appearance of many Algerians, his conclusion couldn't have been from a simple visual calculation. The emphasis on the visual in colonization was countered by Fanon with an emphasis on listening and observing relationships. He listened to people and observed the quality of the relationships they had with others, how they approached him and each other in different contexts. Listening to Algerians in a psychiatric hospital exposed him to the acute fears, fantasies, and anxieties of that society. He would have heard those who had retreated completely into the stereotypes of colonial normality. He also listened to how imperial elites spoke about Algerians, how Catholic bosses talked to Muslim employees, how French medical doctors talked to their Algerian patients. He also observed how Algerians responded to the introduction of the radio and how their attitude changed as they became involved in their own liberation. Note that he did not construct his understanding of Algeria by solely reading academic texts. Instead, he examined the political economy of the region, how colonization reorganized and impacted the people through racialization, and he discussed issues directly with the members of revolutionary organizations in the region. And I think this last part of being in communication with revolutionary organizations, throughout Africa and France, throughout the world, is a key part, because revolutionary organizations are also spaces where very sharp intellectual debate happens, right? So outside of academia, where people are doing close readings of texts and engaging in debate and, looking at new evidence and coming to new conclusions, this is also going on in those spaces outside of academia. So another point is that he didn't confuse the bourgeoisie, the national elite, the proletariat, and the peasants with each other. So if you've read Wretched of the Earth, you have probably noted that he spends a great deal of time, right, talking about the class struggles within African societies. And so even as he identified the colonized struggle against colonists as the central struggle to advance structural change, he continued to conduct a social class analysis within Algeria. And in fact, it was through his analysis of the national bourgeoisie, in contrast to the imperial bourgeoisie, that the scope of the colonial problem became even more evident. Comparatively, the national bourgeoisie and the colonies were completely ineffective, unable to perform the revolutionary role that had been described of them in imperial nations. In short, he conducted a critical political economic analysis that revealed that the way that Algerians were being, quote unquote, favored by the French was entirely colonial. And so when Fanon is, when you're reading his texts, you'll note that he is referencing different colonized people from all over the world. And so when he is evaluating the experiences of, Martinicans in the Caribbean, Algerians in North Africa, people in Latin America, he rejects minimizing one form of racism or exploitation from another, as what he is trying to argue and advance is that all of these are examples of the collapse of intersubjectivity in the colonial world. And a big part of what I see him doing is advocating for us against disassociating ourselves from the fate of those in our midst, right? And so that our actions here and now where we are commit us to the character of our humanity. So Fanon also, he objected to any theoretical or political position that didn't foreground establishing human relationships. He also rejected positions that tried to remove pathologies from their social context, right? So, he writes about if you witness an adult person in a colony demonstrating a feeling of inferiority, the explanation of that issue needs to be found within the processes of colonization, right? So not to attribute it to, something pre-colonization, that has to do with pre-colonial culture or that sort of thing, or to turn it into something completely removed from the social context in which the issue emerges, right? So that I think is also an important part of what he talks about. And so he diagnosed Algerians in the following way. Anti-Blackness was not an innate trait integral to the Arab, but rather it was displaced aggression. The source of the problem, the practices of the imperial bourgeoisie, was obscured by the racist intersubjective structure that had been put into place through colonization. The the righteous aggression that the colonized felt for being hyper-exploited is misdirected, which in many cases meant the aggression was internalized or directed to those closest to them. Right? And so, Fanon's ultimate point and goal, right, is to end anti-Blackness. Colonized people need to be put back, as he said, in their right minds and bodies. Right? Because as I said before, he says that there's a pervasive issue of depersonalization. So the last point I want to mention is on how Fanon assessed racialized claims between colonized people. He rejected the assumption that Black, Arab, and Indigenous peoples are predetermined groups who can be identified through mind-independent properties. Rather, he asks us to approach looking at the other through an analysis of the relations they are situated in and experiencing. This can't be done by a simple surface evaluation, right? Economic relations, relations in and with established institutions, media representation, etc. are all necessary. In short, racist perception is immediately available, and Fanon asks us to reason. And that is the short piece that focuses on how I think Fanon is speaking to African-Arab relations. So does anybody have any questions or comments or thoughts, connections that you may have?
I do.
I think there's someone's hand in the corner.
So, yeah, I really loved your talk. Thank you so much for visiting us and for presenting your new work. So I had a question because I've only read White Skin, Black Masks before, but I'm reading Mexican philosophy right now, and from the 50s. I'm not exactly sure when Fanon was like writing and philosophizing or whatever, but a lot of the Mexican philosophers from the 50s also talk about this like inferiority complex that's like that comes as a result of colonialism. And I just wanted to know, like, do you know if like Fanon would have been reading any like Mexican philosophers, like, or maybe the Mexican philosophers just ripped off Fanon, like, I'm not sure, but I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah. It's a question that I've been wondering about, because one of the things that really interests me, about people writing in the 1950s is that, and even before that, that people in these revolutionary organizations have a very sharp and accurate knowledge, have very accurate knowledge of other places around the world that I'm unclear how it would have been communicated. I don't know if through the radio, newspapers that were circulating. In the case of Mexican philosophers and, what Fanon was writing and what other people were writing, it may also be about the way that philosophy circulates, which I'm also curious about. I mean, how does it... I know in Fanon's case that he was he took courses with Merleau-Ponty. He was obviously, working with Jean-Paul Sartre. So I don't know if, I'm guessing there were ways that, and maybe someone else might know, how it is that people's writing circulated in earlier, at a time when the internet was not a reality, so yeah, I don't know for sure, but I'm very interested to know like how it is that, I think, when I read even Marx, writing at an earlier time, I mean, so like what he understands about what was happening in Mexico, I mean, it's more accurate than I hear a lot of people, right? And I mean, he was writing in an entirely different time. So yeah, that's something, I don't know if anyone else has any insight on that.
I don't, Daphne, but I have a question of my own. I wanted to ask you how you, or if you, link, your study of Fanon and anti-Blackness in Algeria in the 1950s, to either a U.S. context that you see here now, and as well as all of the different ways to try to either mediate or to intellectualize or to resist or to advocate different forms and manifestations of anti-Blackness in the United States today.
Yeah, so that's the long-term goal of my project. Is there's a lot of sort of moving parts, and I kind of move between them. But yeah, so one of where I'm at with the research on that question was actually assessing the political economy of the United States through the 1950s on, in relationship to places like Mexico, Germany, Ireland, Italy. So I'm getting to it, but because so it's like I'm following, and about the question of methodology. So I'm actually following Fanon's methodology to see what it reveals, right? To see what it tells us, and I'll conduct an assessment of it, but sketching out a political economic analysis, right, is the first stage. And so looking at what the class relationships are between not only within a nation, but across nations. So that was a roundabout way of saying I'm getting there.
I did want to throw something out there related to, I guess, the discourse of anti-colonialism. I know there's been a lot of mention or reference to Marx, but also Lenin specifically referred to colonized peoples and anti-colonialism. So that was a discourse. Lenin participated in the Russian Revolution, whereas Marx was theorizing, right? That was out in the world in terms of social movements. That's just my guess. That's part of the discourse, I think, that would have been around in the 50s and whatnot,
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. So Marx was directly involved in social movements, for sure. But yeah, so actually Fanon had an ongoing debate with the French Communist Party. And so in part, actually, how he develops his analysis of, because actually, so throughout Fanon's life, in his writings and his political work, one of the things that he's trying to do is to basically make contact with people in Europe who are listening and open to liberation struggles, right? So, and so he identifies, revolutionary groups within Europe as possibilities. And so he does make efforts, to engage people, to convince them, right? He wrote a number of articles saying, very explicitly, this is to the European left. And while some people, he ends up breaking with the French Communist Party, but there are other white leftists that are convinced by Fanon, right? And this is what is people like Emanuel Wallerstein, so the world systems school of thought, right? These are all people who are convinced by Fanon's arguments and, are of the left, but they move away from what might be called Eurocentric Marxism. So, yeah, so that for sure, there is circulation there, yeah, and I don't know if, how communication is circulating between different organizations. Through the mail, I don't know. I'm very curious. I'm hoping at some point we'll come across something, that tells me.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say, Daphne, because, one of the things that we were reading in class today had to do with the production of the discourse of multiculturalism in Latin America as well as the United States. And I think that, one of the things, or the under-theorized aspects of multiculturalism has to do with, we have the critical tools to think about, the kind of the capitalist appropriation and the state appropriation of multiculturalism as a kind of directed, sort of prefabricated discourse that is designed to kind of appropriate and channel the energies of either minority movements or minority populations. But one other aspect of multiculturalism that that we had a speaker come to talk about last week, and I think is also important, is the other side of it, how multiculturalism was also in a way, in part, a product of the struggles of both the left to kind of redefine or reorient itself around questions of race, racialization, racism, and the institution of slavery and the long-term effects that it had, which I think, as you're showing or as you're saying, actually had an impact on decolonization movements, and also had an impact on the sort of the production of the transformation of progressive thought in the post-war period.
Yeah, so it's interesting because, I would say that there's some important delineations, because I don't know, I didn't get a chance to read the second article that you read for today. Sorry about that. And without knowing how multiculturalism was being defined, but what I would say is that what historical materialists, African Marxists were advocating is not a kind of multiculturalism that is, we're all just different people in a capitalist system and, let's all just accept each other. But rather, it was more about recognition between colonized groups, about empowerment collectively, to actually address the structural problems, that people are facing, and to change the economic system. Right. So I think that's key, right? That, so that's the only thing I would, because it's actually interesting. These are major debates that are also happening, later on in later decades, right? Is like, what is, so one of the cases that I was reading about was the Festac 77. It was a festival happening in 1977, post-independence throughout Africa, throughout different countries of Africa, and organizing the Organization of African Unity. This was an organization that Fanon advocated for, and that a number of people were involved in. But even in later decades, there were debates about, what should an African Union look like? Does it include North Africans, right? Or does it just include people south of the Sahara? Fanon, Toure, a number of people, namely, African Marxists, maintained, that the African Union should include North Africa. And it was actually, interestingly, it was people like Senghor, a Negritude poet who was the president of Senegal, who was the strongest opponent, that North Africa should not be included. And so these debates, while I'm talking about, the writings of Fanon, there were real world implications. It shaped the way that international organizations are, who can be a member, who can't, those sort of things.
Right.
Yes, which is part of why, what Sylvia Wynter, why, she's really asking us to think about, when we say who our people are, or when we say the word we, who are we including, right? Both subconsciously and explicitly, right? And really making, really thinking about it. and being deliberate, about it.
I have another question, kind of like a clarifying question. So,
Yeah.
I just wanted to understand a little bit better what the concept depersonalization is supposed to be, because, yeah, I kind of attribute Fanon with the concept of like double consciousness, like where he's talking about like the black man living in France who kind of has like this inferiority complex because of like who he's told he is, like basically like his self is like split in two. So is the depersonalization, like, is it like, does it have to do with that?
It's more from psychology, and that's one of the things that I'm wanting, because he mentions it almost in passing, like not in passing, because I mean he says this is his diagnosis, but so depersonalization has to do with when you have experienced levels of trauma that you don't, it's like you can't, you're in a state of disassociation, like in an extreme sort of a way, and so you don't recognize. It's almost like you're going through the world and you're not situated, it's like you are not embodied. I hope that makes some sense. I don't know. Yeah, because these are I mean, disassociation, I mean, these are symptoms that a lot of people experience when when experiencing traumatic situations. And so what part of Fanon's line of argument, right, is that colonization, right, is not only economically devastating, right, but it's psychologically devastating also, right? It's a traumatic event, an ongoing trauma, right? And so people are responding as traumatized individuals. And so in the attempt, and this, we can see this in a number of different examples, where the person who is being abused will start identifying with the abuser, right? And
like internalizing your self-hatred.
That's exactly, yes. Yeah, so that's one of the responses, right? Where it's like you start accepting, right? You believe what you're being told.
Sorry, I had a discussion in one of my classes the other day, and we were kind of just talking a little bit about anti-racism and like just the idea that like there's a narrative that like as like a person of color, as like a minority group, that you have to constantly like fight with, like not seeing yourself through the eyes of like what your oppressors have like said to you, and like how you have to consciously understand that those are two narratives out there, and like kind of like dismiss the other narrative for the sake of like just existing in the world. And it's not like a clear matter of choice, like, oh, I'm just gonna choose not to believe that. Like there's like so many layers of like consciousness and unconsciousness that you have to like dissect and like see clearly through, so it's like so easy to be like outside of like yourself.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah, exactly. And so that's what colonization does, right? Like we live outside of our bodies. Basically, we start seeing ourselves as the colonized, as the colonizer. We start, and so yeah, he writes about children in Martinique, describing themselves as little Parisians and this sort of thing, where, and obviously, there was social change, right, that happened in Martinique, right, because he talks about how consciousness changed, right, in Martinique before and after Césaire, right, and yeah, so a part of my project, and is that people, consciousness can change, right, both the collective, the intersubjective level of consciousness, right, as well as individual consciousness. And how to do that, right? That's a whole other question, right?
For a very interesting revival of Fanon, no? A little following up on the first question that was asked about how much Fanon knew about philosophers in Mexico, I would like to ask you the influence of Fanon on Latin American thinkers more generally, no? And so what I have in mind is, for instance, dependency theory, no? And also, I mean, all the way from Prebisch to Cardoso, And then also, I mean, this idea of internal colonialism, which was proposed many years ago by Aníbal Quijano, for instance, who was a co-worker, a co-teacher with Wallerstein. So there's some international connections that have had serious repercussions, even in terms of their translation into the daily politics, and how you deal with each other and how you perceive the revolutionary potential of workers, peasants, and so on and so forth. I was wondering what your thoughts about this is, if you have given it some thought. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I said world systems theorist, but dependency theorist. Maybe that's the term that. Yeah, so he, definitely was of influence to the dependency theorists in Latin America. For people like Quijano, obviously for Nelson Maldonado Torres, Dussel, and those are more. I guess I was trying to think of at that time period, if what the influences were, in the 1950s and that sort of thing. But for sure. From the 1960s on. And so I did study dependency theory, and it shaped my understanding also. And so that is part of how I write as well. So when I'm doing doing the economic assessment, definitely shaped by dependency theorists, and Samir Amin, who's one of them. I think Samir Amin's work is extremely helpful.
Mm-hmm. So I was thinking, I really don't know too many pieces of Fanon work, but I was wondering if somehow all this, all his work have some influence over anti-dictatorship movements in Latin America during the 60s?
I don't know of anyone specifically, but I know the principles of his thought, must have been, even if not specifically Fanonian, it's like those who had one of the reasons that I keep returning to Fanon, there's a lot of reasons why I keep returning to his work, right? It wasn't something that I decided ahead of time, and then just went with it. It was more like the questions that I had every time I looked at him as one of the people, so what are people saying about this, right? I found, he had a very, sustained, systematic analysis of it. And one of the things that keeps me, returning to Fanon is that he had a very clear analysis and discussion of self-other relations, right? And so dictatorships, any kind of relationship where there is a negation of human agency of any group of people, right? He critiqued, right? He would get into, arguments with people about it all the time. So so I don't know if anyone was specifically referencing him or not. I'm not sure.
I was thinking more about this urban guerrillas, not related with a specific ideology, but more something more about fighting against capitalism and dictatorship in more general and structural form. Yeah, that's it. But thank you so much for your reflection.
Yeah, no problem, yeah. And I'm still thinking about the question about dependency theorists, and I'm just wondering if maybe I could say a little bit more about that, because I guess just acknowledging that Fanon was, influenced. And so Wallerstein actually wrote an article, right, about how he made a turn, right, that towards what Fanon was talking about in his way of talking about colonization. And so one of the things that I think is important or a difference in shifting to understanding colonization as sort of the key issue, that needs to be challenged and addressed at that time, and I would argue today too, is that what he was arguing was that colonization establishes a situation where there is no recognition between the colonized from the colonizers to the colonized, right? So colonization is not just the incorporation of other groups and lands into, European territories, right? It's not just about, laying claim to lands, but the expropriation, the hyper-exploitation is accompanied by a negation of recognizing the colonized as human beings at all, right? And so for a revolutionary process to actually be possible, there needs to be, basically, it's like the colonized are being denied recognition, and in order to push social issues forward, the colonized need to force themselves onto the scene, force the colonizers to recognize that what they are dealing with is not, that basically just forcing them to have to see, that there are people, and that wasn't going to come from conversation, it wasn't going to come from, and he tried, he was trying to convince people through words, right? But this is why he turns towards, there must be a struggle.
Yeah, what you're saying, Daphne, I think, also brings me back to like something interesting that I hadn't really thought about just the highlighting the specificity of Fanon speaking in the 1940s and 50s, which was an era in which his ideas were profoundly shaped by decolonization movements. I mean, these are movements that are happening throughout Africa, they're happening throughout Southeast Asia. Whereas in Latin America, I think the situation was in some ways the exact opposite. Like that, if anything, these were countries that were celebrating their centennials, or they had finished, in the 1920s, celebrating their centennials of having become independent republics. And so the whole kind of question of like going back to think about the colonial period, going back to think about colonization, in any case must have happened in a very different way than it did in a context where the actual militant politics of decolonization, of basically becoming independent national republics against the French or against the Germans or against the British or against whoever, like those, or Belgians, those politics were, in any case, happened very different in a context where you have these established national republics, but established national republics that are subverted at every turn by the so-called world system of historical capitalism and the peripheralization of countries like those in Latin America, that make a mockery of what political independence actually is, right? And so I think that the whole kind of way of thinking about and through and going back to the colonial moment happened in a very different way, probably in a lot of countries in Latin America. And another difference I think that is interesting to note is that, the kind of the other, the privileged sort of idea of imagining or projecting otherness in the Latin American context was through the marginal figure of indigenous peoples. And so again, it's like a kind of a slightly different history when you look at, for example, in the 1940s and 50s, that's in Mexico, those are the years of the Lázaro Cárdenas administration, which had built upon and developed the indigenista policies that were first kind of developed under the administration of Vasconcelos in the 1910s, 1920s. And then in Peru, you've got José Carlos Mariátegui, who is sort of presenting a kind of a counter critique of indigenista policies from the perspective of socialism. So, I mean, it just seems like that there are these kind of points of touchstones of comparison, but also contrast in terms of thinking about what is colonialism when you're looking at it from the perspective of, national independence for 100, 150 years versus when you're looking at it as the actual present moment in which many countries in Africa were undergoing their movements of decolonization.
One way of putting that same question in very simple terms is what did Fanon know about the independence movements in Latin America?
Yeah.
No? About Mariátegui, for instance, and even Aya de la Torre, no? In the Andean context. So I was wondering, now I'm curious. I mean, I have read Fanon, and I did find very little about the historical reasoning about Latin America in his work.
I mean, he does, what I find interesting is that he does, when he's critiquing what's going on in African nations where the national elite are positioning themselves as the beneficiaries of the revolutionary movements, he says, we could just look to Latin America to see why that doesn't work, right? And why, what the problem is with that, right? And so he seemed to be aware of, of the, how the independence movements, became, co-opted, claimed, by national elites, and basically that basically it was an unfinished revolution, right? And so while I don't know if there's anyone who has written because he mentions it very briefly, but it seems to be a part of, his awareness.
Well, another interesting point of contact that I would wonder about is the Cuban Revolution, right? Because that's really like a point of
Haitian Revolution.
Yeah. Yes, of course, the Haitian Revolution. Yeah.
So he actually. I was talking to someone about this last week, where Fanon. I mean, he gets to Algeria. When he finished his training in school, he was applying to different places, and so he did actually apply to return. I can't remember exactly what the position was and exactly when, but he did at some point apply to return to the Caribbean. And so it would have been before the Cuban Revolution, but he would have been there in time, right? So, people wonder, what would it have been like, if Fanon had been there, because, he was very clear on certain questions, and
a little bit in a prolongation of that. I mean, there is Maoism as well, no?
Yeah.
Which is this fight from the rural areas into the cities, no? Where you can actually make a liberation movement, no? And implant a different economic model.
Yeah.
Decentralized.
Exactly.
Well, we've kept you talking for a long time, so we wanted to thank you again. Yeah. We wanted to especially thank you because I know that you haven't been feeling well the past couple of days, and we kind of kept you stuck to the lecture anyway. But we're really grateful that you could visit us today. Thank you again, Daphne.
All right. Thank you all.